what's the best way to change someone's mind? It's by living a life that is so great and that is so loving and shines so bright that people can't look away. And they look at you and they say, what does that person have that I don't have? We need to remember that we have truth on our side, and what is true is also beautiful and good.
Hey guys, today I'm going to talk with Gina Florio, who is a podcast host herself, a writer, and a women's health expert. She's someone who is passionate about women's health and femininity, a wife and a mom, but she has an amazing story because she didn't always, I think, have the values she has now, and she's public about that. She shares kind of her history of being a graduate student at Harvard, and then before that, working and after working in women's magazines, and in some ways, doing the opposite of what she's doing now. So Gina, I'm so excited to talk to you. Thanks for joining the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I've kind of watched you from a distance, and I think I first was DMing with you maybe back when you had just left San Francisco or you were just leaving San Francisco. So I'm from the Bay Area, and I was like, oh, cool. Someone who is sharing values, pro-marriage, pro-family values, pro-life values in the middle of San Francisco. You don't see that a lot. But the more that I kind of saw of your work, I was like, wow, she has an amazing body of work sharing about femininity and womanhood, but you didn't always have your values. So I really want to hear your story. You're highly educated, very passionate. And let's start from the beginning. Where are you from originally? Where were you born and raised?
Yeah, I grew up in South Georgia, a little town right outside Savannah, Georgia. I grew up in a very quintessential American family. My mom immigrated here from South Korea, but my dad, born and raised in the States, he's Italian. And my parents didn't raise me in a political home, but we were always conservative and we were Christian. And I was just raised that way. It was all that I knew during my childhood. But then, as it happens, I got to college. And during college and graduate school was when everything changed for me. I was presented with critical race theory, and I was told that I was oppressed because half my family is immigrants and because I'm a mixed race woman and I'm a woman in general. And so things really changed in college and graduate school. And I always like to tell people this little tidbit. When I went to Harvard for graduate school back in 2011, people were using they, them pronouns back then. So this is, over 10 years ago, before it was anywhere close to being mainstream. But that's the kind of school environment that I was in for 6 straight years. So that completely changed the way that I saw the world, and everything that I thought was true about being patriotic and marriage and motherhood and family just being the norm for people, that all got flipped on its head. And suddenly I left graduate school hating the world, especially hating America, thinking of marriage as an oppressive patriarchal system that was meant to keep women in the home and stop them from living their full dreams. I would probably have described myself as pro-choice back then. I was kind of in the mindset of, well, I would never get an abortion myself, but who am I to stop a woman from expressing her freedom of choice, right? And it's so funny even thinking about that now, because today I don't even use the terms pro-choice because I find that to be a propaganda term. For me, you're either anti-abortion or you're pro-abortion, and that's it. But it was really during graduate school and the couple of years after where I like to say I went off the deep end. I shaved half my head. I dyed my hair blue. I lived overseas and I swore off capitalism, and I even swore off my family for a while. And it was a time of darkness. Looking back on it now, it's one of those things where you see a lot of these women at protests, or a lot of these girls in colleges and universities. They're angry. And of course they're angry because they are denying the natural order that God has given us. And it makes you bitter, it makes you resentful. And that's the phase that I was in for a few years of my life. And after I graduated from graduate school, I sort of went on this wandering path where I was teaching yoga. And that's when I started writing for some mainstream media publications, women's digital media, the kind of websites that were not only news and culture, but lifestyle and health and beauty and fitness. And that's what I did for a few years. I started freelancing, and then I was a part-time writer, and eventually I was a full-time editor. And that's when I was in San Francisco. I was in San Francisco full-time, 9 to 5 in the editorial room. And it's funny because in that job, that was the time where my life flipped back around again. It's hard to explain exactly what it was, but it was in San Francisco. I think that San Francisco was almost so crazy that it flipped me back over to the other side.
So before that flip, which is so interesting that, you went through this journey and you had the original flip of coming from this, as you said, kind of idyllic childhood, and then you go this other direction. But just so folks listening can understand this, your whole story here, did you have a faith during those 6 years, 6+ years when you were at university and graduate school, and then you got to San Francisco? Like during that time, did you feel that you had a faith, or was that part of the process for you rejecting faith?
Rejecting faith was a huge part of it. I grew up in a Protestant, non-denominational church, and towards the later years of my teenage life, it turned into a mega church, and that was a really big part that made me kind of turn away from the faith. And then when I got to college and graduate school, I considered myself agnostic. I flirted with the term atheist for a little while. And then I remember in grad school, I was attending Unitarian Universalist churches because I acknowledged that there was something that was bigger than us, but it definitely wasn't the God, the Judeo-Christian model of God that I knew before, or that I had grown up with. But rejecting my faith and rejecting Christianity was a really big part in that time in my life, because when you reject, like I said, the natural order, and when you reject, the model of marriage that Christ gave to us, of course, you're going to reject all tradition and everything that comes with womanhood and femininity. So that was definitely a big part of it.
I'm really interested in if you've done, as you look back on that time, I'm sure you've thought a lot about, okay, what were the moments that kind of got you into this totally different worldview, you could call it, from how you were raised. But do you think part of it was when we're raised in a certain belief or certain values, they do embed themselves, I think, deeply on our DNA, so to speak, our kind of psychological DNA. But unless we really choose it, as an adolescent, it's easier for us to reject it, right? As kind of a rebellion. What do you think it was for you? And again, it can be hard to answer too, because it's well, what is the reason anyone chooses something that's not true? I mean, there can be a million reasons, right? In the end, does it make sense? Some people would say it does, some people it doesn't. But can you kind of walk through what you think it was for you that was the reason that you just totally entered into a different ideology?
Yeah.
Or into an ideology.
The thing that, what hooked me, and I think what hooks a lot of women, is fake compassion. It seems like real compassion. And part of it is because, half of my family is Korean, and that whole entire family, English is their second language. And I remember seeing some moments growing up where someone would make fun of my mom, or because my grandmother can't speak English. And if she would come visit us, people would make fun of her because of the clothes that she wore, because she looked different. And when I was a kid, it was, one of those hurtful things. But when I got into college and I was sitting in these diversity and inclusivity classes and groups and seminars, I was told that was because of structural racism. That was because of structural oppression. And I was told that if you had true compassion, then you would believe in things like equity, then you would believe in things like feminism, then you would believe in things, even things down to the abortion industry, right? Supporting that. And so it was the compassion that hooked me. And I think, again, this is something, I forgot who said this, but I read it on Twitter. It was this long thread about how the woke ideology is inherently feminine, because what it does is it hinges itself on compassion and equality and equity and inclusivity, and these terms that naturally women are drawn to, because women, it is our greatest gift to be compassionate, to be empathetic. When we hear a baby's cry, we hear it differently than a man does. These are gifts from God, especially when they're used in the right context of nurturing, even if it's not necessarily nurturing our own biological children. But to be a mother, I believe, to be a woman, I believe, is to nurture in some way. And so that's why the woke and progressive intersectional ideology appeals so well to women. And that's why statistically women support it much more than men do, because the left has been so successful as framing the intersectional ideology as a compassionate thing. And it even comes down to the transgender ideology, gender theory, the LGBT community, all about compassion, acceptance, tolerance. And that to me was a hook, because I had recalled some moments in my childhood. I grew up in a very small Southern town where it was half white and half Black, and there was nobody Asian or Indian or really Hispanic. And when I was very young, 6 years old, I kind of remember feeling different because we were different. And at the time, my parents didn't ever say anything about racism or oppression. My dad would just say, "You're different. People look at you because you're different. You're a little bit exotic." But then that was reframed into being something negative. So that's really what hooked me into the progressive ideology, until I realized that it's completely fake compassion. And that can be applied to anything from feminism to abortion to gender theory. It's all fake compassion.
Such a good point. And that's why it's also so hard to oppose it, because even opposing it makes you look mean. Or, people, if they're living it, they feel like they're being mean because I'm just trying to be compassionate. At least that for many of them is the intention. So when you got to, you mentioned you got up to the point of San Francisco. You're in San Francisco, you're working, and things start to change for you. Tell me more about that.
I spent, I don't know why, but I started spending my Friday and Saturday nights watching YouTube videos. One of the first things I did was I watched one of President Trump's speeches unedited. And I hated Trump like any liberal woman did. You can look up my name. I wrote articles about how Trump was causing a mental illness issue in our country because I hated him so much. And I wrote articles for women's magazines about how he hated women, and he was a misogynist, and he was a sexist. But someone asked me to watch an unedited video of Trump's speeches, and I just knew in that moment that I was being lied to about something. And then that's when I went down the rabbit hole. I started watching a lot of videos from Candace Owens, started watching a little bit of Charlie Kirk. I love to watch Victor Davis Hanson videos. I watched some of Dinesh D'Souza. I started to watch a lot of Dave Rubin because I think his content, especially back then, was very appealing to people who were classically liberal, but kind of interested in maybe the other side, listening to Larry Elder. And that's when the wheels really started turning. And then I will never forget, Lila, I watched a live action video. Like I said, I would have described myself as pro-choice, but like many women, I didn't know what an abortion actually was. And I think this is why so many people support it. Like a lot of the live action videos of the sort of man on the street videos where this person asks someone on the street, "Do you support abortion?" "Well, yeah, I do. Have you ever seen an abortion?" And they show the video and the person is horrified. That was me. I watched what happens in a medical abortion and a surgical abortion. I cried so much that I called my mom. My mom has always been very conservative and anti-abortion. I called my mom and I said, "I cannot believe this is what abortion is." Because I think a lot of women are under the impression that you just go to the doctor, you take a pill, and the baby just kind of goes away. And you don't really understand the violence of it and the brutality of it. And that was a really big turning point for me. And I said to myself, again, this is fake compassion. It's got nothing to do with choice. I hated that term pro-choice from that day on. And watching all these videos, I decided to be quiet for about a year. I deleted my Twitter account. I kept going to work, but I went to work with many, everyone there was very liberal and outspoken feminist, but I just stayed quiet and I read a lot of books and I kept consuming. And it took me about a year to really come back. And in that year, I started feeling a pull back to Christ and a pull back to God. And during that period, it was, I was still a little bit disenchanted with the kind of churches that I grew up in, and getting a little bit disheartened with a lot of what I saw in Protestant Christianity. Today, my family and I are on the road to converting to Orthodox Christianity, which has been a really, really big blessing. But returning to the ancient faith has been monumental for us, and especially for me, and continuing to reframe the way that I see the world. But that period of time it was about that year where I just saw a lot of the videos online, because that was a really big year. I think 2017, right after Trump was really elected, and the media kept doubling down on everything. And I think that was a big year for a lot of people because the veil was pulled back. And that's one of the big things that brought me back.
Did you have friends during that time who had more you could call them conservative values, or, what was your community like during that time? I mean, you mentioned calling your mom. Sounds like you're close with her and would talk with her sometimes.
Yeah, in San Francisco, of course, as you can imagine, everyone hated Trump. Everyone was very, very progressive. But at the same time, I was very into the fitness community and people. And I started doing martial arts. I started doing jujitsu, which is where I met my husband, actually. And the fitness and the martial arts world tends to lean a little bit more to the right, just statistically. And that's a different tangent you can go down about why that is. But I was spending time with a lot of people who maybe were leaning a little bit to the left, but they were not very, very progressive like most of the people in San Francisco were. They were actually very open to discussions. They were very open to hearing different viewpoints. So I wasn't surrounded by a lot of people that were rabidly progressive, for a lack of a better term. I had a lot of really close friends that I connected with on a level that wasn't necessarily about politics or culture. And having that community of friends that didn't really like talking about politics, that was actually really helpful for me because I felt like I didn't have to fight with people all the time. And at work, I kind of kept my head down and I didn't really spend too much time with the people that I worked with because that was really, I would say, the place where people around me were the most progressive. But, all in all, it was good to be around people who were kind of neutral about politics and they just didn't really want to talk about it very much.
So it sounds like you had space, you could call it, in your personal life to explore these other viewpoints without getting the blowback. And I find that just really interesting and meaningful because, we are so influenced by the people we spend time with. And, they can really prod us one direction or another, whether it's intentional or not. Do you think if you had, like, let's just say the people you were hanging out with, like having brunch with or working out with, were sort of like passionate, anti-conservative, anti-religion people, do you think that would have affected you? Or how do you think that would have affected that process? It's a little bit of a hypothetical.
I think it maybe would have encouraged me to argue more, which is why I'm really glad that the people that I spent time with didn't want to talk about politics because I tend to be a bit more of a confrontational person. So I don't shy away from arguments, but I'm glad that in that time, I didn't argue with people because I wasn't ready to have a fight. I really wanted to just sit back and consume and sort of let things unfold. So I think that if I had people close to me in my life who wanted to really talk about politics and who were very anti-conservative, it probably would have ended up getting into these kind of aggressive arguments and aggressive conversations because I'm never really one to back down from a verbal confrontation like that. So I'm glad that it wasn't like that because people ask me all the time, they say, how are you still friends with your friends from San Francisco? And I still have friends who may have very different viewpoints from me, but I established such a different connection with them that we can see different parts of each other and we can see that we still have common ground. And I think that I was very blessed. I think God blessed me in putting me in a circle of people that were not very combative and that were truly welcoming and were able to see me for who I really was and not see me for my politics.
Do you think with friendships like that, because, I have friends who are also like you're describing, not aligned, you could say politically or even faith wise or values wise. And but it's you don't spend a ton of time talking about those things, but that can also be hard when those things are very important, to you. How do you navigate that?
It's always finding the common ground and it's always kind of finding the humor in it. I definitely have a couple of friends that they like to talk politics sometimes, but laughter goes a long way. And I think sometimes if we spend too much time online, which many of us spend a lot of time online, it's so easy to feel angry. It's so easy to feel combative. But I think once you kind of remove yourself from the world of social media and the arguments that can take place there, you realize that even just 10, 15 years ago, people didn't really like to talk about politics in the workplace, in social events. They just didn't like it. And so now we're in this very heightened time where it's just kind of the default. People love to fight about it. So if I do approach these conversations, maybe with older friends or acquaintances through those friends, it's kind of just finding a way to make people laugh and kind of make light of it and kind of and just be kind about it. Because one thing that I've learned is you're never going to change anyone's mind by arguing. You're never going to change anyone's mind by raising your voice. And one thing that I have found, even through health and fitness and wellness, is that what's the best way to change someone's mind? It's by living a life that is so great and that is so loving and shines so bright that people can't look away. And they look at you and they say, what does that person have that I don't have? And so if I do ever approach these conversations and things can get a little bit sticky, I try to remember that if I am combative, that's not going to make them change their mind. If anything, it's going to push them away. So is there a way that we can approach this with some laughter and a little bit of light?
And how does that work? I think you're spot on about that in a personal relationship, showing respect and like the humor and openness and the ability to listen and not just argue. Those are all really valuable. And then finding what you do connect on and what you do agree on. What about when you mentioned social media, you're using social media to share your view on something that you think is of utmost importance to the public good, and I know we both do this and a lot of our friends that are in that space, right? What about that and the tone or the approach for that? Do you think that you think is effective versus not effective?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always come back to what is true. And I always try to remind people that the intersectional progressive ideology is rooted again in fake compassion. And so what we need to do is we need to remember that we have truth on our side, and what is true is also beautiful and good. And so I think that we have to remember that, and we have to be bold enough to speak the truth in kindness. And sometimes the truth can be very hard to hear. It can be very difficult to hear. And this is something that I especially approach when I talk about health and wellness and the obesity rates in America. It's not an easy thing to hear. I think, especially in America, we are uncomfortable talking about health, talking about the rates of obesity. Almost half of Americans are obese today. 70% are overweight. This has a very real effect on our society, on our culture, on the well-being of our neighbors and our loved ones. And so when we talk about these difficult topics, we have to do it in truth. And truth is inherently kind. We should not lie to people and tell them that abortion is compassionate. We should not lie to them and tell them that feminism is good for women, or something like free the nipple is good for the women, or that obesity is beautiful and healthy. Like, we have to approach these topics with firm truth. And along with truth, naturally, inherently, you can't separate truth from compassion. To be compassionate is to be truthful. So that's the kind of tone that I tend to take online. And at the same time, I really try to point out how the progressive side manipulates women. They manipulate women. They do such a good job at manipulating women and taking advantage of some of their best qualities. Again, some of our best qualities are being compassionate, being empathetic, worrying about the well-being of others. That's what we do as nurturers and as mothers. But the media has done such a good job at capitalizing on that and capitalizing on our insecurities too. And that really applies to the body positivity and fat acceptance movement, but it's malicious. And so at the same time, we have to point out that it's malicious. The abortion industry preys on women. The fat acceptance movement preys on women and their insecurities. So as we speak truth and kindness, we also have to very boldly point out that these mainstream machines do not want the best for women. And so they lie and they take advantage of women's compassion and empathy.
It's so tough when you have the truth is seen as unkind inherently, right? And then, what do you do when someone says the truth is hurting me, therefore it must be unkind?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I shared a video. It was a public video I found on TikTok of people's eating habits in a day, and just the amount of fried food and fast food that they eat. And, when you share a video like that and you just remind people, look, guys, we need to worry about the health of our neighbors. Half of Americans are obese. We're the mean ones for saying that. We're the ones who are unkind. We're called the bullies, but we have to be able to understand that that's not true. Like, if we're speaking the truth in kindness, we're actually the good guys here.
And so you mentioned, Gina, that you've come all the way from, having this ideology to losing the ideology. Now you're married, right? You have a baby. if I understand. And what's that been like for you?
Motherhood, I think motherhood changes you for the better if you allow it. If you really just allow it, I think it it makes you see the world very differently, and it makes you, I think, care much more about the well-being of others and care more about the state of society because you deeply care about the world that your children are going to grow up in. Becoming a mother has been such an incredible, magical experience for me because it really makes me think a lot about how I used to reject marriage and motherhood when I was younger. 10 years ago, I thought, I'm never going to get married. I used to think that having kids was a selfish thing. When it actually is the most selfless thing that you can do is to bring another life into the world and to devote your time and energy and your love to this helpless little baby that comes from you. And it's made me more compassionate. It's made me more patient. I think I always say this. I think that women they'd be surprised at how much of a better person motherhood makes them. And when I say that online, people are always like, well, there are abusive moms out there. There's some people who are really terrible mothers. Of course there is. But if you allow motherhood to really change you the way that it naturally does, I think it makes us into better human beings. And I think it makes us into more resilient women. It makes us into more caring women. And it's good for society to have more moms, because it teaches us that there's so much more after our life. We have to worry about our children and our grandchildren, and it makes us really concerned about the future of our society.
I mean, Miley Cyrus said, I don't know when it was, a few years ago, and there's other comments like this coming from some very influential celebrity types and a lot of like ideologues who say it's actually selfish, like you said, to have kids, and you're hurting. I can't hurt Mother Earth with new human lives. What would you say to someone listening who, maybe they have a friend or maybe they themselves struggle with that? They hear so many of the problems that the extra carbon footprint of another life brings, or they're just worried about another life growing up in a toxic world, or they're worried about being able to be a good enough parent for another life. What would you say to those sorts of objections?
So one thing that is rampant in women today, especially women in their 20s and 30s, is high rates of mental illness, anxiety, depression, the use of antidepressants, feeling isolated, feeling lonely. A lot of these women that feel unworthy. I truly believe that most of these women would feel very different about their lives if they did the selfless act of bringing life into the world. Because the thing that's most amazing about motherhood is that it allows you to take the attention away from yourself. And that sounds, in the world of self-care and self-love, that sounds like the worst thing that we can do. We are hammered by society, whether it's through TV, movies, social media, influencers, celebrities. We are constantly told to focus more on ourselves. We're constantly told to improve our self-love and our self-confidence and our self-acceptance. We are born naturally selfish. That's how God created us. From the day that we come out of the womb, we are selfish human beings. And we actually need God to help us be more selfless. And that was the perfect thing that Christ did in this world when he came down to earth, is that he lived the most selfless life, and he died the most brutal death because he loved us. It was the most selfless act. And I think that a lot of women who struggle with feelings of anxiety and they are so obsessed with self-care, the self is a bottomless pit. You will never, ever, ever, you will find that you're going to get enough self-care because we are just naturally selfish. And so it sounds counterintuitive, but I really think that for many of these women, bringing life into the world and devoting your attention to this beautiful baby that needs you every step of the way is the antidote to these feelings of unworthiness, to these feelings of depression and anxiety. And when I say that, people are shocked because they think, well, I'm not going to have time for my self-care if I have a baby. I'm like, that's the point. You don't need to obsess over yourself every second of the day. Imagine, it's actually freeing. There's so much freedom in not having to be chained to our own selfish desires, to have a child that needs us. And like I said, I think it makes, in many, many cases, it makes women into better human beings. And, of course, the carbon footprint, and it's the left has done such a good job at feeding us the propaganda that our planet is not able to handle any more humans. But I mean, it's complete nonsense. I mean, even Elon Musk talks about the decline of the birth rate and how that's going to significantly affect future generations. I think we're below birth replacement rate right now, and that's really concerning. So not even for our own reasons do we need to have more children, but even to just further the human race and continue our society, we need to get more serious about having more children.
Well, the natural state, of Adam and Eve in the garden, so from a theological perspective, is sinless. I mean, Adam and Eve in the garden were created just with abounding love for each other and for God. And you mentioned the natural state of, a woman is to have love for her child. And that's a beautiful gift from God, just like you're saying. I think this idea that we're just naturally selfish, well, we're wounded, right, by sin. Original sin is a wound. So that is actually, it is actually in a way natural to us in that we suffer this wound, yes, but it's actually not how we were designed. We weren't designed to be selfish. We were designed to be abundantly loving, to love and receive love. And that's the beauty of another person is, to be a subject, not an object, but a subject that we can love and that can love us in return. And it's also a vocation, right? It's a calling to be a mother. And how do you know? People say, well, how do you know if I'm ready for kids? I said, well, did you get married? Is it a marriage? Are you married? Yes. Okay. The purpose, the design of marriage, if you're blessed, is to be fruitful. So yes, there you go. Love your spouse, love your child. And, if God gives you that child, love that child. And that's just an incredible blessing and a way to live a life fully and truly alive. You mentioned, and I want to end on this. I know we've got to wrap here in a few minutes, but you mentioned exploring, or you're on a journey to find, I think you call it an ancient faith. And I love that language about, the idea that Christianity is not some like modern fad, it's a 2,000-year-old faith. Why orthodoxy? And what do you mean by orthodoxy?
Yeah. So Orthodox Christianity is not so well known here in the States. It's kind of very easily broken down into the Christianity of the West is the ancient Christianity of the West is Catholicism, and the ancient Christianity of the East is Orthodoxy. And there are a few, very big differences in terms of theology between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, but we share many of the same sacraments and many of the same rituals. And growing up Protestant, I always felt confused a little bit because there are over 35,000 denominations and every church believes something different. And I realized that the older I got, the more I learned a little bit more about Christianity and the Reformation and the Great Schism of 1054 that separated Orthodoxy from the Roman Catholic Church, the more I realized that church authority is a good thing. Having that authority is actually a relief for us. And I think that for me, being a Protestant for most of my life and abiding by sola scriptura had left me feeling a little bit lost. And there were so many different answers, this self-interpretation and extreme individualism of Protestantism really left me feeling just kind of lost and lost in the mix. And I had Jay Dyer on my podcast a little over a year ago, I think now, and he grew up Protestant like me, and he spent, I think, maybe 10 years in the Catholic Church, and I don't know, however many years ago now, he converted to Orthodoxy, and he introduced Orthodoxy to me and my family. And after, a little less than a year of kind of studying a little bit more, and we started attending an Orthodox church last year, we're on the conversion path now, and it has been a real great sense of peace for us. And there's something about the ancient faith that makes sense, and it puts the whole world into a perspective that feels very peaceful and very healing. And I think that what many Americans need is not only a return to Christ, but a return to the church. There's a lot of comfort there. As you know, as a Catholic, Lila, there's a lot of comfort and peace to be found in the church. And I feel really blessed and grateful that we're able to find this when my daughter is so young, so that she's able to grow up in the church. Because I think what our society needs more than anything else now is more devout Christians, people who are going to speak about their faith openly and to support one another in these Christian communities. So that was one of the things that really brought me back or brought me to Orthodoxy was seeing this, the authority of the church as a really good thing, as a source of peace, instead of this sort of self-interpretation that I found a lot in Protestantism.
It's so interesting, and that deserves its own podcast.
I
Because
know.
my story was similar to yours, raised, interdenominational kind of Protestant background. And I actually would end up going to an Orthodox church in high school because I was searching for the ancient faith. And then I would end up, as I learned more, I would end up becoming Catholic as a as a college student. So a little bit of a different journey. I mean, it is the same Eucharist that the Catholic Church recognizes the Orthodox Eucharist, although it says, "Hey, come under the come under the Catholic Church. Let's all unite." That's like the last two denominations, right? Catholic and Orthodox.
Right.
Like, can't we just be one? And it was actually my father. He became Catholic too. A few months after I became Catholic, and I said,
great.
"Dad, what are you waiting for?" Because so much of my journey was actually tangled up in his own theological, I would say, excursions. I mean, he was loved to study the church fathers and doctors as a an adult man, and that kind of bled onto me because I would learn about it from his Western Civ course that he taught me and friends because I was homeschooled. So there's all these like crossovers. But he said, "Well, I'm waiting for the Orthodox Church to reunite with the Roman Catholic." And I was like, "Dad, if you're going to keep waiting on that, you're missing out on the Eucharist." Meanwhile, So, anyways, I need to check out Jay Dyer's story because it's all very interesting. And my ultimate heart is I'd love to see, but that would be our debate, right? Is the Roman Catholic come under obedience to the Orthodox Church or vice versa? What does that look like? So
exactly.
maybe next time.
We can go down that rabbit hole next time. But it is so great. I love my Catholic brothers and sisters because there's so many similarities, and I think there's so many things. I think there's a lot that we can bring to our culture that is going to be really helpful to hopefully turn things around.
Gina, thanks for sharing. I think it's very inspiring and encouraging to hear, the journey you're on, you've been on, and that you're still on. And thanks for sharing, so generously, not just on this podcast, but also on your platforms. And I encourage everyone to check out Gina's podcast and her platforms. We'll link it in the YouTube bio and on the podcast on your podcast apps. But thanks for just sharing truth so generously.
Thank you.
And being so passionate in your pursuit of the truth.
Yeah, well, I have to say, Lila, and I want everyone to hear this too. You were a really big influence for me, not only through live action, which I think live action, you guys do the best work when it comes to anti-abortion advocacy. Like you really do. But what I loved most about you from the very beginning is that you are able to speak about very difficult topics with such compassion and love. And I don't remember exactly which interview it was, but it was probably a couple of years ago at this point. You went on Tucker Carlson and, he was asking you, I forgot even what the issue was, but it was about abortion. And you said something, you said, I'm so sad that this is what women think is the right decision for them. And you were like, I'm really sad that women have been fed this lie about what it means to be empowered and to live a fulfilling life. And that was it was a big pivotal moment for me because it wasn't an accusatory attack on women who have had abortions. It was compassion. It was sadness, this deep sadness that this is the mainstream culture that so many women have fallen prey to. And that this propaganda that has been programmed into women for so long. So your compassion and your work over the last several years has been a really big influence on me. So I want to thank you for everything that you do. I think that the way that you live and the way that you speak has such a big impact on young women. And I think that you and Live Action are doing such a fantastic job at moving the needle. So please don't ever stop. I mean, I pray for you guys because you do such fantastic work. So thank you.
Thank you, Gina. That's so kind and encouraging. Thank you. We're in it together.
Yes, till the very end.
Lots to do till the beautiful end, not the bitter end, the beautiful end.
That's right. That's right.
Thanks so much, Gina.
Thank you, Lila.